Do you get a sense that they're reassessing themselves as English?
You know, these other identities, asserted as they have been, it makes us say, well, hang on, what does that leave for us, actually? You know, who are we then? You know, so I think there has been that process. You know, and I think we've seen that really with efforts to kind of suddenly bring St George's Day back to life, and you know, and the St George's flag, and the kind of, well, who owns the St George's flag? So there's been a lot of that going on, I think.
And this is part of the problem for what we might call a thinking man's nationalism. The attempt by the far right to appropriate Englishness.
The signs of that very brutal, rather vicious assertiveness that you see in the right-wing organisations, you know, something that really scares people. So people are saying we must claim a better kind of Englishness, we must reclaim that, but haven't yet got an answer of what it might mean.
But national identity has never been static. How could it be on an island that over centuries absorbed waves of migration? Within 40 years, 20% of the English population will be made up of ethnic minorities.
There was one time when I was in the Midlands and I was walking past a pub and a whole series of thugs, basically, swathed in the George flag, started doing Zeekarl salutes at me, and I was absolutely petrified. But even having had that experience, you know, I don't think that that they have a territorial claim over a national flag, and why should they?
If you had to frame an ideal definition of Englishness, what would it be?
Just us. You know, it's not them and us, it's just us. We need to kind of not be so apologetic about being English.
The Scots aren't about to vanish in a blaze, and nor are the English going to succumb to xenophobic nationalism. But the rise of the Scots nationalists is at least slowly nudging the English towards thinking of a world after the Union. Nothing less than reimagining England.
Well, Joe McAlpine of the SNP is still here. We're also joined now by Owen Jones, author of the book Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class. Don Lett, the author and filmmaker who famously introduced the Clash to reggae. And Michael Portillo, the former Conservative cabinet minister. What do you think is happening to our sense of identity?
Well, I think English nationalism in particular is filling a vacuum. I think there's a crisis of identity in many of our communities. I think a lot of that's to do with class, actually. That idea of being working class in many communities as a sense that that's something you could be proud of, that's come under a lot of attack. And if we think of many industries, you can get dewy-eyed about this, they were often dirty, back-breaking jobs, but there was a sense of pride in work, that these were industries which were the backbones of many communities. Unions provided a kind of collective sense of identity. All of those have come under attack, and I think English nationalism has helped fill the vacuum there.
Don, you like Britishness, don't you?
It's worked for me for the last 55 years, I have to say. I mean, it's taken a long time to get there. I mean, I describe myself as British-born black, and a term that kind of rolls off the tongue now, but, you know, growing up through the 70s, that was a very confusing concept. And it wasn't until, I don't know, I guess the late 80s that being black and British actually seemed to make some kind of sense. Now in the 21st century, you're asking me to decide whether I'm British or English. And that's kind of disturbing, because I never heard this conversation during more prosperous times. You know, and I have to wonder how much it's related to the economic climate.
It may also be to do with, with respect, your age. I mean, it was quite interesting with Zubaydah Malik there in the film. Ethnic minority considers herself English.
Yeah. Well, you know, I saw the struggles that my parents' generation went through trying to become anglicised, and the soul-destroying process that it was. And it was down to my generation to reclaim some kind of sense of identity and understand what we had to bring to the party, so to speak.
You're reassessing everything, aren't you?
No, I'm not actually. I think Britishness is and has been for a long time defined as being anti-fanaticism. It goes back to Elizabeth I, the understanding that fanaticism of Catholics or Protestants would tear the kingdom apart. And it seems to me that anti-fanaticism is still a characteristic of the British. and it is a characteristic which is shared by Scottish and English people to almost equal degrees. And that very strong contributions to Britishness, for example, the enormous Enlightenment figures of Scotland, a huge contribution has been made to Scottish people to this Britishness. Now, there is a feeling in Scotland that, amongst some people, that they want to distance themselves from England or change their constitutional arrangement, and there are even some Scots who are anti-English. I don't think that should confuse us. That doesn't make them non-British, and I think the sense of Britishness is still very, very strong. And the other characteristic, I would say, is the sovereignty of the individual and the distrust of the state.
But why don't you like Britishness?
I didn't say I disliked Britishness.
Well, you prefer Scottishness.
Britishness is a construct, it's a political construct. Now, I would disagree with Michael in that it's about tolerance. I mean, Britishness was first constructed as an emblem of Protestantism. It was to ensure the Hanoverian succession. And then it changed again because it's a construct. So it changed at the time of empire. It represented empire. For me, Britishness, don't want to impose identities on anyone else, but for me, Britishness was about the empire and about colonies and about jingoism
Don's
and about
perfectly
arrogance.
happy with it.
Well, I am now, but it's been a painful process, it has to be said. You know, it's taken a long time to get here.
Yeah. I mean, I can totally see the point that you're making, but it's I think other people have made the point that it's quite interesting that it's easier for people from a non-white background in Scotland to feel Scottish and Pakistani or Scottish and West Indian than it is for them to say that they're English and Pakistani or English and West Indian. They feel the British identity.
You've gone back to that old notion of it being about black and white, but surely it's far more complex than that now.
But also,
well, I can, as I say, I'm not imposing identity on other people. I can only speak for example, in the SNP, we have a lot of members from a Pakistani background. We have members from Scottish Italian backgrounds, and they're very happy with this dual identity of being Scottish and also the identity of their parents and their grandparents' country.
I mean, the thing about Britishness is you can basically define it how you want. That's the problem. I mean, one idea of Britishness is empire.
That's its strength, surely.
But it's, you know, one idea is empire, king and country, aristocracy, those sorts of things. But you could claim another Britishness of British people throughout the centuries fighting for their rights against absolute monarchy, the Chartists, the world's first working class movement, the suffragettes, the NHS. All of these things were collecting for their rights against absolute monarchy, the Chartists, the world's first working class movement, the suffragettes, the NHS. All of these things were collective struggles which people fought for as Scottish, as English and as Welsh people.
But its pliability is surely its strength, isn't it?
Well, of course, and I suppose you can be flexible and you could claim another Britishness, which is about those struggles, being proud of those fights for democracy.
Let's see if anyone here has got a clear sense of what Britishness is. Does anybody... Yes, you, sir, in the red shirt.
I offer you a view that Britishness will come of its own again later in this century. It'll become the federalism by which each of our individual nations survives.
But what is it, you know?
It's the collectivism, the collective spirit of peoples who are united and working together.
OK, you, sir, what is Britishness?
Well, Britishness is aspiration. We're a small country, but we're also a great country. And, I mean, I come from a working class background, and I now work in finance. And, you know, Adam Smith is an inspiration to anybody in finance. And, I mean, people may laugh at that, but, you know, innovation, entrepreneurship, technological development, that is what it means to be British.
Yes, madam.
I think a main quality of Britishness is a comfortableness with multiple identities.
That's a very subtle point. Yeah. Yes, you, sir.
I was going to say that the essence of Britishness is actually, I believe, stability and fair-mindedness. And as for the previous conversation that we had, I believe that the Scots and the Welsh are more nationalistic than the English. I think the English are fairly apathetic about nationalism.
It's rather odd, isn't it, that we haven't addressed, you know, great swathes of our recent history. I mean, if you accept my point that Britishness is about being anti-fanatical, of course, one of the features that has occurred is that fanaticism has cropped up from time to time on the European continent, and we've had to deal with it, whether it was Napoleon, whether it was the Kaiser, whether it was Hitler. And in that respect, you know, there's absolutely no difference in the reaction of the Welsh, the Scots or the English. The British reaction to the responsibility of dealing with that has been exactly identical.
Well, Britain is not a fair union. Britain's not an equal union.
No, you're
because
making another point now.
Well, no, it's not. I think it's important because I don't think the point has been made that
Yeah, you've made it many times. No,
arithmetically, you cannot possibly have an equal union when you have 10% of the population in Scotland.
We're having a stab
and
at trying to define what Britishness is. Yes, sir.
But I'm not sure how important it is to go around with the label. I mean, I'm half Welsh, so I'm watching rugby at the Millennium Stadium. I'm a passionate Welshman. If I'm at Lord's, I might feel English. If I'm in France, I might feel British. And I'm in Vietnam, I might feel European.
Okay.
I'm slightly confused when I'm watching Newsnight, for instance.
And if you watch Braveheart, you hate the English.
What do you make of the way that there's an attempt now by the right to create an English identity, which many people in your position and of your persuasion find pretty disturbing?
Very much so. I think there's racial dimensions in particular. I think a lot of it is to do with insecurities. It's to do with economic insecurities over housing, over jobs, which I think a lot of mainstream politicians have failed to tackle. It's been very easy in that circumstances for the far right in particular to say, well, look, people like you aren't getting a house, you're not getting a job. Why is it going to this other? And back in the day, those were black men, then they were Asians, and today, more often than not, it's Muslims. And I think that racialised nationalism is something which is very concerning and something which people should be very guarded about.
But it's not only concerning. A movement that's based on hate and intolerance is ipso facto, by its very definition, not British. I mean, that is the irony. These people who go around claiming to be English nationalists are not British, and they demonstrate it by their behaviour.
Well, why do they call themselves the British National Party then?
Well, because that...
And why do they fly the Union flag at all the rallies?
Because that is all a trick. But what I'm saying is, if you have any understanding of what Britishness really is, it actually excludes hate and intolerance.
I don't think Indians would have said that in the 19th century. I don't think people would have said that during the slave trade.
No, but I'm talking about Britain today, and I'm talking about the way that has evolved. All countries have evolved. Obviously, what the United States is now is not what it was between 1860 and 1865 when it fought a civil war. But what Britain has arrived at today, that after centuries of experience, in my view, going back to Elizabeth.
Perhaps you're speaking as an Englishman who's very comfortable with the arrangement. For most Scots, we're not comfortable with the arrangement.
Actually.
Well,
half Scottish with Spanish parents.
Michael,
no, one Spanish.
One Spanish.
You're comfortable with the arrangement. Many people in Scots feel.
What do you think you are?
I think I'm British and English, and I have a Spanish father and a Scottish mother.
Now you say you were trying to make a point.
Yeah.
There you go.
So one of the problems, I think, with these definitions that we hear are that it's so often defined by what it's not. We're against this or we're anti that. If you spoke to these, far-right people in the English Defence League and said, what do you really actually stand for, not what you stand against, personally, I think they'd be hard-pushed to answer the question.
Were you trying to make a similar point? Or
no, I just think that Michael's point that defining Britishness as what it's not is not strong enough, and I think that that's part of this problem. And you can be a chameleon about it and say, okay, now we're going to be a new type of evolved Britishness. But the reality is that the English need to really focus in on what is English.
I'm not defining it by what it's not. To be anti-fanatical is to take a very strong position in life and in history. The British position in history of opposing fanaticism, both within our own shores and on the continent of Europe and around the world, is just one of the boldest and most magnificent positions that's ever been taken by
Michael, you actually...
There's nothing vague about it at all.
You're airbrushing a huge amount of English history there, this idea we've all been moderate throughout our history. I mean, we had the first great European revolution. We overthrew our monarchy in the 17th century before, about 150 years before the French, and we actually got great inspiration for that French Revolution on that basis.
Why did we overthrow the monarchy? We overthrew it because we thought it was fanatical. That's exactly the point. The Glorious Revolution...
But these were radical ideas which flourished, like the levellers, the diggers. These were what you regard as fanatical, but were very English.
When we thought Charles I was turning out to be a Catholic, when we thought James II was a Catholic, because he was, we overthrew them both. And after Cromwell, who was a very fanatical Protestant, after he died, we got rid of that. We have always opposed fanaticism. That's exactly our defining position.
But I think throughout history, as I say, these radical struggles, the Charters...
If I could say, one of the first acts of the British state, if you like, was a pogrom in the Highlands of Scotland. They were after the Jacobite...
We're not getting back to that.
Well, no, you're talking about history, but it wasn't an example of
I want to ask you to look
tolerance.
forward, all of us to look forward. If two nations as close in history and in geography as Scotland and England cannot get along in a single political entity, I mean, it makes you ask all sorts of questions about the future of Europe, doesn't it?
I've been asking those questions for a number